There are so many iconic watches out there, but unfortunately they're out of reach for a huge slice of the population. So if you've got your eyes on the prize but your bank account's got other ideas, then this is the list for you. I'm going to be looking at 10 of the most iconic watches ever made, tell you a little bit about why people give a shit about them so much, and then show you the cheapest way to get a similar experience. So if you're looking to get a flavour of those legendary watches or want to test drive the feeling before splashing out, stick around. The last one is, shockingly, not at the beginning of this list. A little PSA here before we get stuck in. The absolute cheapest way to get a likeness of your favourite watch is to buy a Chinese-made homage, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. But it can be very easy to stray dangerously close to an all-but-name fake in this territory, so I'll encourage you with this list to pick stuff that's got at least some degree of difference. Your mileage will vary, but for me, encouraging these manufacturers to take a couple of steps away from the photocopier is only ever a good thing. So let's start with perhaps the most faked icon since Pamela Anderson's chest, the Rolex Submariner. It wasn't the first, but it was, perhaps surprisingly, the cheapest. At least to start with. Believe it or not, but Rolex used to flog the Submariner alongside Worms and copies of Fisherman's Weekly in bait and tackle shops. It was basically Rolex's big break. The 1940s Datejust boosted annual sales from 10,000 to 50,000, but the Submariner kicked that up to 100,000. It's common business practice to focus on growth by offering something highly competitive, and the Submariner was not only a cheap entry into the dive watch genre, with even an affordable non-chronometer option offered to bring costs down further, but also, at the time, the only choice. Here's what gave Rolex the edge. They didn't give a shit. As a hangover from the era of pocket watches, the big-name watchmakers concerned themselves way too much with how elegant and svelte their watches were, not so much how they functioned. And whilst the Submariner was as elegant as climbing that imaginary last stair in the middle of the night, it was very functional indeed. It just so happened at the time that an emerging generation of free-loving individuals had eschewed their parents' taste for sophistication and instead adopted a more down-to-earth approach to expressing themselves. Jeans, t-shirts, and stainless steel sports watches. The luxuriation, I checked it, that's a real word, of this category since is as ironic as Burning Man's ticket prices. So how do you enjoy this extremely desirable and expensive icon today at prices even a mud-rolling hippie can afford? Well, that's for the first of our questionably titled Chinese manufacturers, Thorn, to take care of with the retro water Ghost, which, in the back-to-school sale, retails at just £95. Rather than out-and-out copy the current Submariner, this is a bit of a part spin special that utilises an early Submariner Explorer-style dial with gilt Mercedes hands, all set inside a Tudor-esque crown-guardless case. The name Thorn starts to make a bit more sense now, borrowing the vintage Tudor typeface and relating to the original Tudor Rose logo. It's made of 39mm 316L stainless steel, gets a sapphire crystal and a Seiko NH35 movement, although I'm not sure how much I'd be willing to stress test the supposed 200 meters of water resistance. Our next iconic watch is one that at first glance appears to have suffered something of a manufacturing error, slanting the dial at 45 degrees to the right to create a reading experience more suited to a curious dog that can read. We're talking Vacheron Constantin's unlikely historique American 1921, a watch perhaps unsurprisingly built for the North American market in the year of 1921. But why was Vacheron Constantin dumping wonky watches on the American public? Was America basically a factory seconds outlet for the prestigious watchmaker? No, at least not in this case. The 1910s and 20s were still very much dominated by the pocket watch, and with Patek Philippe's seminal Calatrava still a good decade or so away, it was as much to do with the Model T Ford as it was anything else. The Model T, the first affordable mass-produced car, democratized road travel and thus presented a business opportunity for Vacheron Constantin. Imagine the pitch. You're riding along in your automobile, your baby beside you at the wheel, and you ask her what the time is. She fumbles for her pocket watch, she crashes, you all die. Cartier takes notes. To avoid this horrifying sequence of events, Vacheron Constantin instead proposed to fasten a small pocket watch case to the wrist by means of a strap held in place with soldered wire lugs. That case was cushion-shaped, as was in vogue. Now, you might quite rightly at this point be thinking, hang on a minute, this is just the story of the Panerai Luminor. Yep, same deal, except Vacheron Constantin did it first. In an extra twist, quite literally, Vacheron Constantin also rearranged the dial so it could be read without letting go of the steering wheel. The crown was also shifted round from 12 to make winding easier, although it didn't make it all the way around to 3. The £135 Baltany affordable Microbrand cushion watch attempts to revive this niche style for substantially less than the Vacheron Constantin's £38,900 and offers a degree of separation by swapping the Breguet style hands and numerals for a well-loomed early pilot's watch arrangement. This actually harks back to the original 1919 version of the Vacheron Constantin, which shared its dial design with many other pilot's watches of the First World War. The 38mm case is again in 316L stainless steel, with the choice of an automatic or hand-wound seagull movement to slim it down to just 9.5mm. The glass is sapphire and the water resistance a perhaps more believable 50 meters. Really, the origins of the stainless steel sports watch don't trace their way back to any one particular model, but a series of them, evolving over time to create the homogeny we enjoy today. However, if you were to point a finger at patient zero, it would probably be the Rolex Oyster. It wasn't the first water-resistant watch, but it's the one that made them cool. It was predated by limited-run military waterproof watches, and even an Omega that put a case inside a case so it can dive while you dive. But what made the Oyster so impressive was simply the fact that people had actually heard of it. This was no coincidence. Founder Hans Wilsdorf engineered a marketing concept that would go on to become the blueprint for the watch industry. Whilst other watch brands simply made their watches and hoped for the best, Wilsdorf slapped the Oyster on the wrist of an athlete the moment all media eyes were on her, as she attempted to break a swimming record and then made a big deal of it in a front page ad in the newspaper. And he did basically the same thing when he added automatic winding to his Oyster watch as well, borrowing an idea from someone else, making a song and dance about it in the newspaper, profit. It boggles my mind that some watch brands still don't get this formula even today. If Wilsdorf were still alive and well in 2024, he'd definitely be twerking on TikTok. The Oyster Perpetual really was a genuine revolution, in a practical, mumsy kind of way. It was the take a jumper or you'll catch a chill of watchmaking, protecting the movement from moisture and also from the user, who would inevitably destroy the crown thread trying to wind it every day. Whilst it's the entry point into Rolex's modern collection, it still costs as much as topping up my printer ink. So as an alternative at just £98, it's the 39mm Addiesdive Automatic with a black or white sunburst dial. At the risk of repeating myself, it's 316L stainless steel with a Seiko NH35 automatic movement, although the crystal is mineral glass and not sapphire. The 100-meter water resistance is give or take a meter for every pound you'll lose taking it that deep. It doesn't get much love despite its iconic nature, although that's no thanks to Breguet's insistence on making it an easier pass than Logan Sargent. The Type 20 Pilot's Chronograph stands alone in Breguet's collection for being functional, relatively simple, and overall starkly iconic, and that's down to one simple fact: someone else designed it. How did Breguet, manufacturer of tourbillons and watches even your granddad thinks aren't cool, end up making a pilot's watch for the French military? Well, they were actually already making instruments for aircraft, known as aircraft instruments, since basically the beginning of powered flight, including chronometers, chronographs, and a device that adds vocal fry to the radio. So when the French Air Force put out a bid for the manufacture of its carefully designed pilot's chronograph, Breguet duly obliged. It's pretty simplistic by modern standards, but a challenge for 1953, requiring a large crown that could be wound with gloves on, a flyback chronograph, resistance to magnetism and temperature, and a rotating timing bezel. Type 20, as it was designated by the French Ministry of Defense, became Type XX in Breguet's parlance, not in devotion to the Wandsworth-based indie band, but as in the Roman for 20, used to delineate its military versions from its civilian ones. Now write that out 100 times or I'll cut your balls off. The £151 San Martin equivalent will not be fulfilling the French military's requirements by a factor of nearly all of them, not least of all because it has a Seiko VK64 mecha quartz instead of a mechanical movement. It's not a flyback, it's not anti-magnetic or particularly temperature resistant, although it does have a smooth sweeping second hand. At 39.5mm in 316L stainless steel with a domed mineral crystal and no hideously ill-conceived date window, it's still a better looking watch than the modern Breguet. I think there's no prizes for guessing where the £84 Pagani designed Royal Oak gets its inspiration. If I were being generous, I'd say this octagonal addition to our list was inspired by the same tree in deepest Shropshire that gave refuge to the future King of England, Charles II, as he hid from battle, played by Rowan Atkinson in the film. Rather, I think it's inspired by the watch inspired by the boat that was inspired by that tree, a famous entry into the pages of horological history from Audemars Piguet. When all is lost and you've got nowhere left to go, you turn to a Swiss designer called Gerald Genter, which seemed to be the mantra of the 1970s Swiss watch industry. The dude was just good at what he did, designing watches that made brands stand out. He was efficient too, designing the Royal Oak overnight, the Nautilus reportedly in just 5 minutes, and the Gerald Charles with a pencil up his bum and a light sneeze. What he wasn't good at was designing watches that made sense. Unlike the sports watches that came before it, his work was spurious and nonsensical. Exactly the kind of petty revenge you'd take when a floundering CEO calls you the night before the big show asking for you to save his company. Joke's on Genter, because that watch became one of the most successful ever made. Designed with a nautical theme in mind, it takes inspiration from a porthole, a diver's helmet, and a cheese grater. And despite being clamped together by 8 unnecessarily present bolts, today only musters 50 meters of water resistance. If you wanted any more proof of Genter's prank, you tell me putting a slot head in an unturnable bolt was a serious design decision. Nevertheless, this extreme unconventionality proved to be the Royal Oak's saving grace. That and the RRP of a medium-sized saloon car. This was the Royal Oak's secret, its ability to make everyone within a 50-foot radius feel infinitely poorer than you. I'm not quite sure if this is what Ronald Reagan had in mind, but now you too can enjoy the unnecessary stylings of the Royal Oak thanks to Pagani design, which gets so close to the line that divides homage and fake, you could barely slip the napkin Genter designed the Nautilus on between them. There are some differences though, such as the single center links rather than the split twins, plus round bolts that actually turn instead of octagonal. I expect those parts may have been designed by a lawyer. The watch that predates the Submariner, the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, has come under a lot of fire recently. So the story goes, it was the first ever modern dive watch, developed specifically for and issued to French Special Forces divers in 1953, then released to the general public several years later, after the Submariner, with no evidence to demonstrate its prior existence. The controversy stems, really, from a lack of data, which seems to have been entrusted to a British government employee and subsequently lost. There aren't any records of its existence before 1955, when the 50 Fathoms watches started getting imported into America for use by the US Navy. Rolex isn't exactly squeaky clean when it comes to this story either. They also claim the Submariner was released in 1953, and although there's evidence of its existence as a prototype in 1953, it wasn't actually launched until 1954. Here's a little something you should probably know about the watch industry when it comes to heritage. Anything's fair game until someone else proves otherwise, and so while Blancpain says what it says and Rolex doesn't contend it, it's gospel. It's kind of like a presidential campaign. You can just make up any old shit until someone calls you out on it. I can see both sides. There's scraps of evidence of other military-issue dive watches before both the Blancpain and the Rolex that otherwise just don't exist because the military has a habit of, keeping things secret. Invasions and the like don't just get put up on the town notice board the week before, so everyone has time to get their hair done. Equally, Rolex aimed for the Submariner to be a widely available watch, aiming it at professionals and hobbyists alike, rather than just a straight military contract. That's really the success of Rolex in a nutshell, having its watches worn by the right people so they'd sell en masse to the general public. So I'm with Rolex on this one. I'm keeping quiet and letting Blancpain have their moment. And you can have your moment too with the Watchesdives Vintage 50 Fathoms for the faintly amusing sum of £69. When Blancpain revived the 50 Fathoms in 2003 for its 50th anniversary, they abandoned this original look, and in true Swatch Group style, is refusing to make what people actually want, which is basically this Watchesdives. The specification is as per the others, really. 316L steel, a choice of mineral or sapphire, a gloss or matte ceramic bezel, and the NH35 caliber doing the heavy lifting. Crucially, it's not the size of a small housing estate like Blancpain insists on, coming in at a vintage appropriate 40mm. If you didn't know that Omega manufactures the first watch worn on the moon, then hello and welcome to Watches. You must be new here. The Speedmaster Moonwatch is by far and away Omega's favourite creation, dressing it in name brand trainers and sending it to an Ivy League, whilst the others live out a Dickensian childhood in the basement of Omega HQ. Whilst the Speedmaster of today might be becoming a bit of a pastiche of itself with a moon-textured movement and a spinning Saturn V second hand, the original classic remains a faithful addition to a catalogue more bloated than an AMW script at an all-you-can-eat Chinese restaurant. The reason it's so continually successful is just about the same reason Rolex watches are considered timeless designs. They haven't really f***ed about with it too much. Whilst the Royal Oak et al. Are very much on a high at the moment, they go through phases of extreme hype and absolute revulsion, but like this rash, they keep coming back. Because the Speedmaster is what it is, to be what it's supposed to be, a clear, easy to use chronograph, there's not a single thing superfluous about it. That's why die-hard fans default to a solid caseback when the sapphire reveals that incredible manually wound caliber, because it's redundant in the function of the watch. Neil wasn't all like, that's one small step for man, do you want to see my cock? And so this storied watch remains one of the most impressive and most desirable in the world. It's also getting up there in price. Omega thinks we haven't noticed it sneaking the Speedmaster closer and closer to the Daytona, but we have. It's like my dog trying to eat my sandwich by feigning affection. So if that price hasn't just left orbit for you, but is out beyond the Kuiper belt and heading for the Oort cloud, then the Specht & Sons Speedmaster at £74 might be a little more down to earth. The high contrast dial and external bezel are trademarks of the 50s and 60s era sports chronographs, and so is the price. The sapphire crystal and VK63 Mecha Quartz, however, are very much modern day. I think what impresses me most about Rolex's rise to legendary status is the scrappy way it went about getting there. Whilst other watch brands sought complex methods to contemporary problems, like the challenge of keeping track of 2 time zones, Rolex took the Kabylame approach and pointed out the painfully obvious. Like for the GMT-Master II, combining a simple 24-hour hand with a turning bezel. Rolex wasn't the first to do it that way, with the Glycine Airman arriving the year before, but it did it best with a cheeky little addition that would make it iconic, the split-tone bezel colour. What better way is there to get a quick impression of whether it's day or night back home than with the dark and light colours of the GMT-Master bezel? Something hasn't been this retrospectively obvious since the Titanic's unsinkability claims were countered with, "Are you sure?" The GMT-Master has actually been a long-standing testbed of new technology for Rolex, with the original featuring a loomed Bakelite bezel that could also be read at night. The modern ceramic bezel was first introduced on the GMT-Master II as well. Unfortunately, Bakelite, a precursor to plastic, was as robust as R. Kelly's Defense, and was switched out for the aluminium already found on the Submariner. It was a GMT-Master record-breaking pilot Chuck Yeager wore when he flew faster than the speed of sound, making it the object of desire for every pilot following in his footsteps. That's why the Apollo astronauts, when not wearing their standard issue Speedmasters, chose to rock the GMT-Master instead. The Speedmaster was basically wrist-tang. Today's GMT-Master II is still very closely related to that original, but with some modern refinements, because with rose-tinted glasses aside, early Rolex sports watches are actually pretty flimsy by today's standards. If that's what you want, however, IXDAO will happily oblige with the £220 GMT, which combines 904L steel and an NH34 GMT caliber with a sapphire crystal and sapphire bezel to recreate the original GMT's vintage look. Ever felt like you were a little late to the party? That was Zenith in 1969, the proud creator of the first internationally available integrated automatic chronograph movement, all the while completely oblivious to the absolute shitstorm about to rain down upon it. It was the eve of quartz, a new technology that would make everything Zenith had done up to that point completely redundant. The El Primero chronograph caliber was the BlackBerry of the watch industry, deeply impressive and incredibly useful, for about 5 minutes before being stomped into oblivion. But nevertheless it remains iconic, not least in its original form, the blocky A384. It wasn't actually that far off capturing the famous 70s aesthetic, but unfortunately it came just a bit too soon. Somehow, like an overdue baby born at 2 AM, it was both early and late. What's right on time, and right on price however, is the Sugess Chrono Heritage at £180. While some of the dial configurations available on the Sugess required less creative thought on their part than others, there are some more original choices to be had. Perhaps the biggest relief is that the Seagull chronograph caliber used inside goes without a date complication, so the unsightly 4 o'clock date window that's featured on the original from the very beginning is pleasingly absent. But perhaps the most sought after and iconic watch in the world has to be one from humble origins, the once unloved Rolex Daytona. It was simultaneously the most blatant imitation from Rolex of all, the biggest failure and the least desirable, which all very much sounds like I might have just popped out for a quick cigarette and lobotomization. The Daytona's incredible success today was a long time coming, and owes both its achievements and its struggles to many of the other watches on this list. As I've pointed out before, Rolex wasn't known so much for its innovation. It never really came up with a truly original idea, but for packaging it up better than anyone else, and the chronograph was just too much of a challenge to repackage. The water-resistant Oyster, restless perpetual and up-to-date Datejust were pretty minor technical achievements. They were just well thought out and streamlined in their execution. The chronograph was always a bit of an afterthought for Rolex, something a bit too complicated for it to be comfortable messing with. The Daytona, or Cosmograph as it was originally known, was really just a delayed reaction to the Speedmaster to cover it off more than anything else. Its biggest enemy was probably Rolex's own GMT-Master, the more expensive, more sought-after addition to the lineup. Daytonas were offered at a discount when the GMT was harder to get, and the exotic Paul Newman dial swapped in by retailers as a last-ditch attempt to persuade customers to part with their cash. Can you imagine having the AD begging you to buy a Daytona? That sounds as likely as a Mensa membership card in Kanye West's wallet. Funnily enough, its rise to fame was thanks to Zenith's El Primero. Whilst Zenith itself had shriveled to nothing, Rolex was taking full advantage of a new era of luxury to relaunch the Daytona in a slick new suit. But it needed a caliber, and so Zenith's El Primero was recovered from archive to make that happen. Today, the Daytona has become the poster child for the commoditization of the luxury watch industry, with more seemingly for sale at any one time than are actually being worn. Nevertheless, it's one of the classic chronograph designs which can be appreciated by everyone thanks to the Tactical Frog solar chronograph, which gets its name from the solar-powered Seiko VS75 movement, and apparently an anonymous amphibian. You know the drill by now, it's got a 41mm 316L steel case, sapphire crystal and ceramic bezel, with the screw-down crown and pushers reportedly sealed to 200 meters. Most importantly, it's not a complete copy of the Daytona, so you get to enjoy a little originality as well. And remember, if you're looking to save some money, try crystal meth. Not only will it massively reduce your appetite, so you'll save a fortune on food, you definitely won't have to worry about retirement. See you next time.